The Honorable the Vice President.
Minister of Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute to this debate on such an important piece of legislation, the Finance Bill 2018. Mr. Vice President, the Finance Bill 2018 aims to provide for the variation of certain duties and taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for other related matters. In so doing, this omnibus bill seeks to amend 31 pieces of legislation. It is noteworthy, Mr. Vice President, that the bill contains a commencement clause, clause 33, which provides for it to come into effect January 1, 2019. In keeping with our modus operandi of delivering on our promises, which is an approach that is diametrically opposed to my friends on the other side, the Finance Bill 2018 seeks to give effect to a number of commitments elucidated in the Budget Statement 2019. Mr. Vice President, these are commitments which address critical areas such as public service, pension reform, penalties under the Children's Act, penalties under the Litter Act, public assistance support, and amendments that would provide a greater level of benefit, in particular, Mr. Vice President, to retrenched persons who are paid severance benefits, as well as persons pursuing tertiary education and first-time homeowners. Mr. Vice President, these are fiscal reforms that are part of the Recovery, Growth, and Transformation Program of this PNM government that is intent on achieving the turnaround that we all, as good citizens, eagerly anticipate. Mr. Vice President, it is quite clear that our government recognizes the interplay between fiscal reform and improving the quality of life of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. In keeping with the National Development Strategy 2016 to 2030, popularly known as Vision 2030, the amendments identified in the Finance Bill 2018 demonstrates, Mr. Vice President, that we as a people, we as a government, we are serious about putting people first and nurturing our greatest asset, as well as protecting the environment. Matters of social justice, social protection, protection of the most vulnerable in our society, and social environmental sustainability, Mr. Vice President, are at the core of the vision of nurturing a united, resilient, productive, innovative, and connected and prosperous nation. Mr. Vice President, the introduction of this bill is testament that we are truly committed to achieving our vision as a government for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Vice President, allow me at this point in time to address a few critical areas identified in this Finance Bill 2018. I want to deal firstly with pension reform. And I turn my attention to this particular issue, Mr. Vice President, because I have always been passionate about pension reform. In my other incarnation, many a representation I would have made on behalf of different workers in Trinidad and Tobago, in particular in the public sector. Mr. Vice President, in keeping with the goal that our citizens are empowered to meet their basic needs. The Honorable Minister of Finance, in the budget presentation, the budget statement 2019, proposed to pay a minimum public service pension of $3,500 per month immediately upon retirement of public officers. And Mr. Vice President, this government ought to be commended, because it means, therefore, we would bring to a halt the suffering of public officers. I know personally, I have personal first-hand experience. We would have made recommendations such as this one several years ago. I have sat here and I've listened to my friend on the other side, in particular my good friend Wade Mark, who sought to trust Senator Wade Mark. Never intend to disrespect my chairman in another place, Mr. Vice President. And I listened to Senator Wade Mark, who chastised this government as though he was not in office, he and his administration were not in power 2010, 2015, and did absolutely nothing to alleviate the suffering of the same said retired public officers. And I sat here and I smiled to myself because, you know, the political machinations are so obvious. But nonetheless, Mr. Vice President, this move by the government will assist a large percentage of retired public officers. Because over the years, the inefficiencies in the public service pension systems have resulted in retirees sometimes having severe difficulty in accessing their pensions. At times, it has been stated here, and it's correct, at times, retirees have to wait 2 and in some cases 3 years and still not receive their pensions. This delay in payment of pension benefits often leads to social exclusionary impacts on the retirees and on their respective families, as their livelihoods are disrupted by the inability to provide some of the very basic needs, including access to food, water and shelter for these persons in our society, Maslow basic hierarchy of needs. Mr. Vice President, we must appreciate that with retirement comes a sense of loss of security offered by the rights and privileges which accompany employment. There's a genuine expectation and right to have continued protection in the face of retirement. This is the purpose of a pension, Mr. Vice President, and I know it only too well, having negotiated many, many pension plans over the years. I am personally aware that in the twilight of one's years, one should not have to worry whether or not one's pension will be paid or not. Mr. Vice President, even though it may not serve as the only source of income, it becomes a major source for retired persons and their families to meet their very basic needs. The children's education, many retirees have to assist with their grandchildren, healthcare, mortgages, etc. Further, Mr. Vice President, retirees are men and women who have toiled many, many years, given their most productive years to the employer, contributed to national development in some way or the other, and therefore they deserve what is rightfully theirs without any hassle and delays. It is unjust, it is unconscionable to place retirees and their families in a very vulnerable position, which can cause them to lose their dignity in having to depend on others for survival. Mr. Vice President, I've said these words so many times over the years, I can say it by heart, so that we understand in this government, and we have taken a very concrete step to bring that hardship to an end, so that public officers who retire will get an immediate pension while their gratuity is being calculated. And Mr. Vice President, let me alert this House that the calculation of gratuity is not often an easy process because, for example, a public officer may have worked in several ministries prior to retiring, and therefore each one of these ministries must submit their pension and leave records. So it's challenging sometimes to accumulate all those pieces of records to facilitate the timely payment, timely calculation, and subsequent payment of gratuity. But in doing so, at least the retired public officer would receive their pension immediately while the gratuity is being calculated. Mr. Vice President, the impact of not having your pension when it is due has far social and economic impacts. While the pension administration system is being improved holistically, it is critical that other short-term measures be introduced. It is within that context that the Finance Bill 2018 seeks to make this a reality by amending the pension provisions contained in the following 11 pieces of existing legislation. 1, the Retiring Allowances Legislative Service Act, Chapter 203. But, Mr. Vice President, to save time, these pieces of legislation are highlighted in the finance bill, and I leave it to the Honorable Attorney General to focus and zero in and drill down. Mr. Vice President, I want to look at a second issue reflected in the bill, and that is the amendment to the Children's Act. Mr. Vice President, I am sure we can all agree that some of the recent reports about the brutality, the neglect meted out to the children of our nation are disturbing, worrisome, and downright unacceptable, to say the least. These reports highlight that we must do more collectively for our children and to protect our children, who can be categorized as one of the vulnerable populations in our society. We have sought to protect our elderly with the changes to pensions, and we're also seeking to further protect our children. In so doing, we would be securing their future. Mr. Vice President, most persons who know me can attest to my emotional connection to children and youth, and particularly more since I have become a grandmother. I mean, what about me? Also my senatorial colleague. I pause at this point in time, Mr. Vice President, to congratulate and commend my senatorial ministerial colleague who was given the joy of having her second grandchild just a couple hours ago. Yes. Thank you. Very good. Mr. Vice President, as a result, since my tenure at the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, the team and myself at the ministry have identified the elimination of child labor as one of our priorities. Not long ago, the ministry presented prizes for a school art competition on this very subject, Mr. Vice President. Those works of art were so well done that the ministry, in collaboration with NALIS, have been exhibiting these works of art done by our children at libraries around Trinidad, and I dare so we will be going to Tobago subsequently. Mr. Vice President, there's no question that Trinidad and Tobago is committed to the elimination of child labor. We, as a country, we have ratified the International Labor Organization Convention number 182, which addresses the need for the immediate prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor as a priority for national and international action since 2003. Mr. Vice President, the elimination of child labor is not only a priority for the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development and the government of Trinidad and Tobago, but it is also a priority for the International Labor Organization in the Decent Work Agenda, as well as a target under goal number 8 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which speaks to decent work and economic growth. Target 8.7 reinforces that we take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern-day slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labor in all of its forms. Mr. Vice President, I raise this issue to allow everyone to understand one of the reasons that I'm giving this bill my fullest support, the Finance Bill 2018. Clause 23 of this bill seeks to increase the fines for the offenses committed against children under the Children Act, Chapter 4601, by 100%, Mr. Vice President. Not 25, not 30, not 45, but by 100%. Mr. Vice President, a number of these offenses refer to activities involving and related to child prostitution, which is one of the worst forms of child labor. I mean, was it night before? On the international news, listening, a 30-year-old male adult rapes a 4-year-old child. Mr. Vice President, what about a 4-year-old child that appears to be sexual, that could trigger a satanic, because that adult has to be a satanic person to destroy, not only rape, that adult destroys that child. I mean, according to Verna St. Rose Graves, Mr. Vice President, my belly boiled when I heard that report. And therefore, it reinforces to us who sit in these hallowed chambers that we have an innate responsibility to protect the children of this society. It is generally said that one can measure a society by the way we treat our youngest and our oldest. Mr. Vice President, the fines associated with these offenses are currently $50,000 under the Children Act. With the passing of this finance bill, all of these fines would be increased by 100%. The thinking, Mr. Vice President, is that a greater fine can act as a more effective deterrent, thereby preventing persons from committing, endorsing, encouraging, facilitating the heinous activity that is termed child prostitution. Mr. Vice President, the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, in our Strategic Plan 2017 to 2020, under the area of labor protection, we have identified the need for a program of action to address child labor. In this regard, we are working within this fiscal year on developing a national policy on the prevention and elimination of child labor. The Cabinet, I would have taken a note to Cabinet, Mr. Vice President, for the appointment of the committee, and Cabinet has approved that committee, and that committee is an interministerial committee because we are not operating in silos. Such a policy, coupled with the amendments to the Children Act, will strengthen our actions in the fight against child labor, child exploitation, and abuse. But allow me, Mr. Vice President, to also address you today, not only as the Minister of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, but as a mother, as a grandmother, as an aunt, but quite simply as a human being. I do not believe that in this honorable House, among all my esteemed colleagues, the members of society, among my friends and colleagues, there can be even one person who will not support something that seeks to protect our children from neglect, abuse, and the worst kinds of exploitation. So then, Mr. Vice President, that is exactly what the Finance Bill 2018 seeks to do. I turn my attention now, Mr. Vice President, to amendments to the Income Tax Act. Excuse me. Mr. Vice President, I do not believe that anyone will be averse to the amendments being proposed to the Income Tax Act in this Finance Bill 2018. Permit me to briefly address two areas with respect to severance pay and tertiary education. The increase from $300,000 to $500,000 for tax exemption with respect to severance pay is clearly a very progressive step and one that I embrace wholeheartedly. Having made representations over the years in another capacity for such an increase, our government recognizes that retrenchment is already difficult and burdensome on workers, and we have been doing our best to cushion the negative effects. I would have spoken in these chambers before on the 10-point plan on unemployment, which the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development has developed. And this plan adopts a multi-pronged approach to counteracting the negative fallouts of job losses. We collaborate with the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Vice President. The objective of the plan is to provide immediate, short, and medium-term assistance to unemployed persons and, where necessary, their families to mitigate against the negative financial, social, physical, and psychological effects of unemployment, and to empower them towards reintegration into decent work in the shortest possible time, either through job placement or support in establishing their own cooperatives. In that context, Mr. Vice President, we would have invited our website, and we are advertising in some of the most cost-effective ways, Mr. Vice President. So we invite retrenched persons, or those persons who are unemployed, to visit the Ministry of Labor. Any one of our offices, Tunapuna, Port of Spain, Central, San Fernando, Point Fortin, where they can bring in their resumes. We have efficient and very helpful public officers who would walk them through the various processes. Our National Employment Service Unit also, where employers register with the Ministry of Labor. So when we receive the resumes of unemployed and retrenched persons, we do match them up with the jobs on our system, and that information is sent to the employer, and the employer takes it from there. Mr. Vice President, while we are implementing this plan, the fiscal measure identified in the Finance Bill 2018 with respect to severance pay provides an immediate and direct relief to retrenched workers. And this measure places a greater benefit in the hands of retrenched workers. It places an additional $200,000 into the hands of the retrenched workers without the taxman having to take away any measure of that. Mr. Vice President, this provision will impact positively on all retrenched workers, not only those at Petrotrin and at TSTT, but those from other state enterprises, but also workers from the private sector. All would benefit. This is not a measure to benefit only one sector in this society, but all workers, Mr. Vice President. This is a far-reaching provision because we understand the uncertainty and fear that confronts persons who have lost their jobs. Mr. Vice President, I am not unaffected like any other person when persons lose their job. I know how painful it is. I have managed many of those situations over the years, many of those situations, and it is a very painful situation. But, Mr. Vice President, there is something, as I noted earlier last week, there's something that is called collective responsibility. And when you sit, you look at what impact a particular situation will have on the country as a whole. And therefore, whatever decision you take it in the best interest of the whole and not a sectoral part. We understand that retrenched persons think first of their families and how they will provide for them. This provision, which will allow more persons to keep a larger piece of their benefits, is intended to assist in allaying, perhaps just a little bit, those fears and for them to pursue other opportunities to make these benefits work for them. Mr. Vice President, the pain of losing one's job can be very impactful. But at the end of the day, we have to pull ourselves together. We have to think about what are our options available to us. Is it that we need to rescale ourselves, to re-prepare ourselves for another form of employment? Mr. Vice President, the ILO is encouraging its member nations to focus on the future work. We will be focusing on the fourth industrial revolution, Mr. Vice President, and that is the technological revolution. Mr. Vice President, the nature of work. I sat here and I listened to Senator Anthony Vera on the last occasion, and he was unbuttoned. He was right on the button. The type of fundamental changes to jobs as we traditionally know them will happen in the not too distant future. And therefore we have to talk to our workforce, and we have to prepare them in a very real and tangible way to re-equip themselves to meet the challenges, greater challenges that we are facing right now down the road. Mr. Vice President, reiterating the importance and priority of this amendment is the fact that it will take place almost immediately, January 1st, 2019. As this government implements Vision 2030, Mr. Vice President, we keep in mind our great asset, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, in amending Section 56A of the Finance Bill as we aim to achieve this goal where our society will be grounded in the principle of social justice. Mr. Vice President, as we can see, this Finance Bill is about the people of Trinidad and Tobago. We have had to make difficult and painful decisions that have affected so many men and women and their families. But these decisions were necessary in order to protect our country's future sustainability and to keep the International Monetary Fund prescriptions at bay. I personally remember, Mr. Vice President, when this country was under an IMF prescription. Many of our citizens lost their jobs. I remember being part of the executive. I was not the president of the Public Services Association at that time, but I was a member of the executive, Mr. Vice President. And I remember our deceased president at the time, Dr. Kenrick Gus Rennie, God bless his soul. Yesterday marked 26 years since he died, but his contribution, we still continue to benefit. And I remember a lot of negative effects coming out of the IMF prescription, to the extent that he came to the executive at one of our meetings and said, listen, we as PSA officers can't continue to sit in this room and discuss how our members are affected and the kind of hardship. You cannot truly represent persons if you're not experiencing what they experience. And therefore, he advised us, encouraged us to take a 10% cut in our salary so that we can understand. And therefore, Mr. Vice President, I understand. Because even as an officer of the union, I could not continue paying my mortgage at the same level that I used to, and therefore I had to make other arrangements. But other persons were not as fortunate, so that IMF prescription, we in this country do not want to go that route, Mr. Vice President. We have also sought to encourage persons to engage in study at the tertiary level. This finance bill, Mr. Vice President, includes a provision whereby the allowance for tertiary education expenses for tax purposes is increased from $60,000 to $72,000. This provision is aimed at assisting all those persons who may be studying abroad. This government supports and encourages those persons who are investing in their future. Therefore, the provision included in the finance bill seeks to give these persons a much-needed cash injection in the form of a tax refund. Mr. Vice President, I turn my attention now to the amendment to the Friendly Societies Act. The Finance Bill 2018 provides for the amendment of Section 3.1 of the Friendly Societies Act, Chapter 3250, to remove the requirement for the Registrar of Friendly Societies to be a member of the public service. Mr. Vice President, I would have spoken on a number of occasions about the legislative reform process that the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development has embarked upon. The amendment of the Friendly Societies Act is but one of those pieces of legislation being accorded priority within our legislative agenda. Permit me, Mr. Vice President, to provide a brief background for persons who may not be aware of friendly societies and their role in Trinidad and Tobago. The Friendly Societies movement has existed in this country for more than 150 years, Mr. Vice President. A friendly society is an incorporative body of persons, unlimited in number, who join together to achieve a common financial or social purpose, or both. They serve as mutual insurance organizations which provide aid to members in distress. Friendly societies also promote social interaction and self-reliance among members. Their watchwords are love, brotherhood, fraternity, truth, friendship, and honor. Some of us in this house can probably remember our parents or grandparents putting their monies into friendly societies as a means of savings. Mr. Vice President, I remember it only too well as a child growing up on a Sunday afternoon. When the sun is at its hottest, you have to leave home around 2 o'clock to go and pay my grandmother's friendly society dues, putting her savings in there. I am telling you, Mr. Vice President, I remember that quite well. So that the friendly, and I'm hearing the leader of government business, my colleague, also Green, he used to do it also. That was the form of savings. Exactly. Excuse me. The Friendly Societies movement in Trinidad and Tobago shares in government's aim of placing people at the center of development and empowering individuals to become self-reliant. At present, Mr. Vice President, there are approximately 50 functioning registered friendly societies in Trinidad and Tobago, with a membership of approximately 6,000 persons and an asset base valued at over $70 million, consisting of property, cash, and other intangibles. Mr. Vice President, the friendly societies are owners of some of the most valuable real estate in this country, reside within the friendly societies. The Friendly Societies movement is governed by the Friendly Societies Act, Chapter 3250. This act has not been amended since 1973, and this has contributed to some extent to the challenges faced by the movement over the past years. Since assuming office as Minister of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, the team at the ministry and myself, we have convened 3 stakeholder consultations on the review of the Friendly Societies Act on November 23, 2016, January 24, 2017, and excuse me, and September 19, 2017. A draft policy position paper on the amendment of the Friendly Societies Act has been prepared and is currently being reviewed for the consideration of Cabinet. Mr. Vice President, the Registrar of Friendly Societies play a critical role in the governance structure of the Friendly Societies movement in Trinidad and Tobago. The Registrar has the responsibility for supervision, regulation, audit, and cancellation of registered friendly societies, and also serve as the chair of the Advisory Friendly Societies Council, which we would have reconstituted some time ago, and it has the responsibility for the strategic direction of the movement. Over the years, Mr. Vice President, we in the ministry have faced a practical difficulty of sourcing suitably qualified and willing persons in the public service to serve in the position of Registrar of Friendly Societies. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The absence of a registrar, as was the case when I assumed office, significantly impacted the progress of the Friendly Societies movement. We approached countless attorneys within the public service, and they were not interested. And therefore, I approached the Honorable Attorney General for his assistance in this regard, and I am very grateful that he identified someone who is holding the position, but whose term has come to an end. So that, Mr. Vice President, the removal of this requirement would make it much easier for us at the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development to engage an attorney at law with 5 years or more service to serve in the capacity of registrar of the friendly societies. In closing, Mr. Vice President, I want to reiterate my wholehearted support for the Finance Bill 2018, which is before us, a bill which at its heart demonstrates the principles of this government, which focuses on putting people first. As the economy of Trinidad and Tobago gradually moves into the phase of recovery, this administration embraces its responsibility of ensuring that it guides the recovery towards a more stable, sustainable foundation. The finance bill before us does exactly that, Mr. Vice President. It brings before us the provisions that would assist in building on what we have already achieved. But however, Mr. Vice President, we are not blind to the challenges facing many around us. And this administration is working to cushion the impact felt by the people. And that is why so much of this finance bill has focused on giving the people more and protecting the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, especially the most vulnerable among us, such as the elderly, our children, and those who have lost their jobs. Finally, Mr. Vice President, as I really close, I wish to remind our colleagues on the other side that we cannot do this alone. The responsibility is all of us. We must also be our brothers and sisters keepers. We must all work together in achieving the goals of the nation, protecting our fellow citizens. I therefore urge all my colleagues on the other side to support this bill. Finally, allow me to extend seasoned greetings to you, Mr. Vice President, the President of the Senate, your respective families, my colleagues on this side, my colleagues on the other side, also the independent senators, and to wish all members of staff of this Parliament a very happy and holy Christmas. Let's remember to keep Christ in Christmas. As we go into this festive Christmas season, I urge all of us to do what we can to help those around us and to remember the true meaning of the season as a time of giving and being very thankful for blessings upon all of us in our individual capacity and as a nation. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Deonarine.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute to this debate today. During a period of economic and social decline, most citizens of this country have been tolerant to the abrasive realities of our contracting economy. The people of this country have indeed been trying to make do with less. The amendments listed in this bill indicate that the government appears to see some light at the end of the recession tunnel following the economic confrontation caused by the abrupt fall in revenues from the energy sector. Government appears to be even more confident of the turnaround, as we finally received a sign of the long-awaited end to a 4-year dry spell in real economic growth. But yet again, the relief in economic pressures is underpinned by increased energy sector production and better international pricing, two factors that policymakers do not have full control over. As we gradually move away from the previous program of austerity for yet another year, there is still evidence of diversification, or there is still little evidence of diversification or implementation of diversification strategies coming to the rescue. Mr. Vice President, I say this because performance in the non-energy sector is still struggling to reach above what we economists call the x-axis. There is a general sense of low business and consumer confidence hovering over the Trinidad and Tobago economy. From the continued foreign exchange shortage, the rising unemployment, rising crime, all translating to some level of risk aversion in the private sector. A sluggish non-energy sector can create challenges on the government's agenda since it influences the effectiveness of economic policies laid out. I have to say that whilst the country is forecasted to grow at anemic rates, there is still some time before we can climb out of the recession and truly celebrate. Today, I would like to share my thoughts on some of the clauses of the finance bill. The bill has put forward commendable amendments, such as preventing leakages in tax collection, removal of the age eligibility on the disability grant, plausible fines to conserve wildlife, 100% increases in fines for cruelty against children, as well as litter offenses. Some clauses I would like to seek some clarification on from the Honorable Minister, through you, Mr. Vice President. These are in the Pensions Act and the adjustments to the stamp duty threshold. Mr. Vice President, I would like to begin with the proposed amendment to the Pensions Act. This measure to pay an interim pension is a sensible short-term intervention to provide relief for the many pensioners who have, in some instances, been awaiting these payments for more than 2 years. We all know income security is crucial for purposes of consumption smoothing and reassurance, especially at this stage of their lives. This measure to pay an interim pension to public servants amounting to $3,500 upon retirement, pending completion of any administrative or other requirements, while plausible, appears to be a temporary solution to a much bigger problem. While I know there are delays in getting pension payments to the retired public servants, I wondered what could be the cause of these delays. Upon investigating, I found the interim report for the Public Accounts Appropriations Committee, titled Examination into the Processing of Payment of Pension and Gratuity to Retired Public Officers and Contracted Employees, laid in this Honorable House on the 20th of November 2018. In this report, it is evident that the issue with the delays in pension has been as a result of gaps in communication and coordination between line ministries and the Ministry of Finance. These gaps have resulted in hiccups in the timely submission of the correct administrative information to the Treasury Division. This, as pointed out during the inquiry, represented a major kink in the process whereby it may take in excess of 3 months from the issuance of the memorandum to when feedback is received of the same. Mr. Vice President, This is a serious and unnecessary problem that we can't afford to have when we are serving the people of our country. Given that the process management system appears to be handicapped, I beg to question how the problem of over or double payment will be avoided following the completion of the administrative requirements that is required for their respective approvals. Furthermore, in the case where an individual is evaluated as not eligible, I would like to know through you, Mr. Vice President, the details on how these finances paid out in interim pension is expected to be recouped. Mr. Vice President, for the sake of these pensioners, I am happy that the Public Accounts and Appropriations Committee was able to ventilate these inefficiencies, investigate the interventions undertaken by the Ministry of Finance, and make recommendations to assist in rectifying this situation. As it is, based on my review and analysis, it appears as if close coordination and monitoring of the processing of pension payments is required. This can be done by, for example, expanding the business process management training undergone in 2015 by the Ministry of Public Administration, I believe. I have to agree with Senator Richards. You see, it is critical that the systems are put in place to reduce the hiccups in this process, since with an aging population, as more public servants enters the retirement pool, the resources and processes should be in place to facilitate ample monitoring, engagement, and control to prevent these inefficiencies. We need to have a resilient process to withstand situations whereby our fellow public servants become starved of their well-deserved rewards and prevent them from being pushed in stressful situations where financial security becomes questionable. Mr. Vice President, I would like to move on to the amendments made in the Income Tax Act and Stamp Duty Act, all of which will result in a reduction in government revenues, with the exception of the increased penalties associated with the lack of compliance with the Board of Inland Revenue. Those amendments that represent revenues foregone by the government are the increases in the threshold for the business levy, increases in non-taxable stamp duty threshold, increases in tax exemption threshold on the severance payments, and increase in non-taxable limits to $72,000 for tertiary education, all of which are attempts to create incentives. In the case of the business levy, small business owners will now be subjected to business levy when gross sales exceed $360,000, resulting in, I believe, a saving of around $2,200 per quarter. In an environment where aggregate demand is low, unemployment is rising, and accessibility to credit is indecisive, I am not sure how far this measure can go to incentivize the existing business community or encourage new setups. With respect to the waiver on stamp duty for homes costing no more than $1.5 million, I commend the government for making a $1.5 million home $24,500 less expensive for approximately 1,000 families. However, with the current distribution of income, the 1,000 families reaping benefits from this measure will most likely be the upper middle class, while there will be inconsequential benefit to a major cross-section of the working population. The increase in the tertiary education allowance from $60,000 to $72,000 during a time where the country is plagued with crime and economic uncertainty, being afforded such an opportunity may be well received. However, Mr. Vice President, I am not sure whether we are taking into consideration if this measure can encourage our families to capitalize on opportunities abroad. Can we as a country afford to lose our productive human capacity in the near future? In terms of tightening the collection and recovery of taxes, by the increased penalty from $3,000 to $10,000 for the submission of incorrect tax information, increases in the penalty for offenses in respect to fraud from $50,000 to $250,000, and the late payment of taxes being increased, the penalty for the late payment of taxes being increased from 15 to 20% per annum for registered clubs, or is it across the board? It's for registered clubs only, right? The late payment of the taxes. Yeah? Okay. These increases are meant to get taxpayers to be more compliant. Strict enforcement here is key to ensure that this measure can contribute to the broadening of the tax base and mitigate tax avoidance. Tax evasion in Trinidad and Tobago has reached the extent of being among the top 5 categories of suspected criminal conduct, leading to money laundering, and have been influencing participation in the hidden economy. As tax evasion increases, growth declines, government revenues are reduced, and the public service that citizens receive are affected. Tax evasion may also encourage perceptions of inequitable treatment and disrespect for the law. Research has shown that in all countries, and particularly in developing countries such as Trinidad and Tobago, the level of tax evasion is likely to be a significant indicator for the presence and size of the hidden economy. The positive relationship between per capita income and tax evasion in the long run shows that government can decrease tax evasion by enhancing the tax collection capabilities. With these increased penalties, coupled with smooth transition to what I hope to be an efficient revenue authority model, would plug the tax revenue leakages. Revenues that escape to financing the profitability of criminal activities could hopefully be captured by the state and redirected to create value-added investments that translate to meaningful economic activity. Madam President, upon reviewing for the first time the Litter Act, the Child Act, Agricultural Fires Act, and Conservation of Wildlife Act, I have to say that I am very impressed with the laws of my country. The amendments are all commendable, and I agree with them from a non-lawyer's perspective. As a matter of fact, I honestly think the fines should have been increased by 200%, but one step at a time, right? Development cannot happen overnight. I look forward, however, to the increased detection rates and the increased level of enforcement of these laws. Respecting time constraints, Mr. Vice President, I will not delve into these individually, but I would like to single out the Children's Act. Over the recent years, Trinidad and Tobago have become victim of a spike in crimes against children, particularly sex crimes. According to the Child Protection Unit, there have been 926 reports of overall serious crimes against children thus far in 2018, a 60% increase when compared to 2017. And I believe the Honorable Minister presented us with some even more alarming statistics indicating that child abuse has exceeded 14,000, right, right. With respect to crimes sexual in nature towards children, in 2018, there has been an 80% increase, and these are just the reported cases. My concern is that harsher penalties may not serve as a deterrent to such criminals when dealing with crimes that are consistently underreported. Sexual crimes against children are being underreported because in most instances the attackers are known to the child. Therefore, Mr. Vice President, in addition to the increased fines, I believe attention also needs to be placed on addressing the barriers and insecurities children face in coming forward and reporting these criminals. Mr. Vice President, I would begin to wrap up. I would like to say the government's approach to pull us out of this 4-year fiscal deficit is to raise fiscal revenues and reduce government expenditure, while to some extent taking into consideration the weakening social fabric of our nation. The government is trying its best to create some marginal incentives, hoping to loosen the knot created by the past fiscal restrictions. These marginal incentives may not necessarily translate immediately to increased economic growth. However, to yield maximum social and fiscal returns from these measures, rigorous enforcement of the law is critical. Looking at things from the expenditure side, whilst the government has cut expenditure from 63 billion to 51 billion, majority of the reduction comes from a cut in capital expenditure. Central government expenditure has primarily focused on financing recurrent expenditure. In Trinidad and Tobago, capital expenditure usually lingers below 20% since the year 2000, but in the last 3 years, it fell to around 7 to 8% of total government expenditure. This means that majority of government's expenditure have been financing recurrent expenditure. And recurrent expenditure, for the viewing public who may not know, is government expenditure on transfers, subsidies, wages, salaries, goods, services, and interest payments. Recurrent expenditure is crucial for sustaining public social welfare programs. However, in a publication by the IDB titled An Econometric Analysis of Energy Revenue and Government Expenditure Shocks on Economic Growth in Trinidad and Tobago, it is illustrated that the economic growth does not favor increases in recurrent expenditure. In particular, an increase in transfers and subsidies eventually reduces economic growth by about 1.3%. And our transfers and subsidy currently accounts for roughly 50% of total government expenditure. What this means, Mr. Vice President, is that after some time, aggregate demand dampens in the country. Clearly a symptom that we have been experiencing. Capital expenditure, on the other hand, stimulates economic growth through its multiplier effect on aggregate demand. Referring to the same publication by the IDB, increases in capital expenditure translates to sustained positive economic growth over time. This low rate of capital expenditure has quite evidently impacted on the country's growth prospects. Therefore, Mr. Vice President, the struggles that the non-energy sector is experiencing has a lot to do with the decline in capital expenditure over the years. Therefore, I would like to emphasize that the revitalization of the country's non-energy sector will depend on the speed of execution of the government's proposed capital expenditure program, as well as the responsiveness of the private sector. In conclusion, Mr. Vice President, I would urge the government to be steadfast and resilient as they embark on their program of fiscal correction. Sustainable and intelligent policies reinforced by proper monitoring and evaluation are much needed, which will fix the root cause of problems and not push the issues down the road. I would remind my colleagues of the implications because all too often, it is the ordinary man on the street and his family who feels the brunt of inefficient field policies. Let 2018 be the last year citizens find themselves unemployed during this season of joy and merriment. Let us not concentrate on passing blame, but concentrate on doing better for our fellow countrymen and country. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Ameen.
Mr. Vice President, I want to thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this Finance Bill 2018. And I sat here, Mr. Vice President, listening to members from the government speak. And, you know, Mr. Vice President, we hear so much about domestic violence and abuse and the long-term effects. And serious long-term domestic abuse can lead to a mental disorder called battered woman syndrome. And very often, victims of domestic abuse report that the abuser would, after an act of violence, be very apologetic, loving, and kind, and even helping to treat with the injuries that they themselves inflicted, and of course repeat how much they love the victims. And hearing the Minister of Labour speaking about the government's 10-point plan to deal with rising unemployment, when this very government is responsible for retrenching thousands of citizens. They have retrenched workers directly. They have refused to renew contracts of employees in the public service as well as in other state enterprises. They have been terminating people left, right, and center. And they are the biggest culprit and contributor to unemployment in Trinidad and Tobago in 2018. And then they come and they offer a little ice pack to put on your black eye. This is what this government has been doing. And when I see the measure that offers the exemption from tax on severance, and it is being marketed as an act of kindness. But this, Mr. Vice President, is a soothing hug after a cough and kick and black eye has been meted out to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So while in itself, it might be commendable to say that that the section would be amended to increase the exemption from tax on severance pay from $300,000 to $500,000. Well, first of all, Mr. Vice President, let us not pretend that this amendment really is specifically to deal with the petrotrin workers, the thousands of petrotrin workers. And of course it will apply to other persons. And my question in looking at the bigger picture, Mr. Vice President, I ask myself, does the government plan more significant retrenchment and severance of more workers in Trinidad and Tobago? So is it that just as you have done with Petrotrin, just as you have sent home everybody, they have already started retrenchment in TSTT and other state enterprise? Is this clause here to offer a little comfort to the 500 TSTT workers that we know have gone home already, and more to come perhaps? We have already been hearing about overload of workers in some of the other public utilities. I'm sorry, the Minister of Public Utilities stepped out. but he spoke earlier about TNTech, the situation with the income versus the subsidy, and the fact that he feels that the staffing there is really too much. This is not the first time we have heard such utterances from the Minister of Public Utilities, but he has also made similar utterances about WASA as well. So we have, Mr. Vice President, this clause 26, while it is good for those who will get more than, who will get at least $500,000, that is not the majority of Petrotrin workers. It would not represent the average worker who is being dismissed. So really, this is an offering to those who are in the higher income bracket.
Yes.
But it is an offering on severance after you have been severed. So, Mr. Vice President, that is one of the clauses that I feel is being offered in line with this government's style of governance, the abusive manner in which they have been treating the citizens, and their marketing of their measures, which are really plasters for the wounds that they themselves have inflicted. Mr. Vice President, this sort of abusive treatment seems to be the modus operandi of the PNM. And it is in the same vein that a number of their promises have been made in their budget. And we see it year after year. And this finance bill is no different, because a number of measures are skewed delivery on wonderful sounding promises that were made, either in their manifesto or in their platform or even here in Parliament. I remember when the government in their manifesto proposed to reduce VAT from 15% to 12.5%. One of the biggest deceptions perpetrated on this nation. And what they did in fact do is the increase from 0 to 12.5%, over 7,000 items that were zero rated under the People's Partnership government. Mr. Vice President, that type of deception continues. I noticed that, Mr. Vice President, that the minister in the Ministry of Finance who piloted this bill spoke with praise of the proposals in Clause 18 of this bill, which will increase the existing disability allowance grant from $1,800 to $2,000. Mr. Vice President, this is another measure that, again, it is a plaster being offered to a sore that they have inflicted on the population. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the scenario with public assistance to persons with disabilities. Madam, Mr. Vice President, this government has increased food prices tremendously. They are responsible for increasing the price, the cost of living in general, the price of transport, for instance, goods and services. When a person who is disabled has to go for medical care, for example, very often, if they are wheelchair bound, they have to hire a taxi or pay someone with a private car to drop them to the hospital and bring them back home. If they have clinic, they're in one of the clinics in a health center or in the hospital, it is the same thing. If they have to go for groceries, any sort of service, anything they have to leave their house for, very often, it is difficult in terms of accessing public transport. Mr. Vice President, the services of the elderly and disabled transport with TSTT has been cut back, as far as I understand. It was an initiative under the People's Partnership government. You still see the small buses, El Damo, in different parts of the country, but many parts of the country are no longer serviced by that service, and in some areas, the number of trips has been reduced. So the persons who are differently abled are burdened with their own costs for transport. This, Mr. Vice President, is one of the costs that would be specific to them when they have to go anywhere. The CDAP drugs that were available to all persons, and this affects persons with disability as well as elderly persons. CDAP drugs are not as available as this government continues to tell us it is. We have asked questions here in Parliament. The Minister of Health has given answers, but that does not reflect the truth of what is happening in the pharmacies and the availability of drugs to people who need them. Mr. Vice President, because the drugs are no longer available from CDAP, the persons who will receive this $200 increase specified in Clause 8 now have an additional expense, which is far more than the $200 being offered here. So just for their medication alone, which is not available by CDAP, the cost is so tremendous, and this $200 increase is nowhere close to compensation or meeting the expense that is caused by the inefficiency of this government in distributing pharmaceuticals through the CDAP program. Mr. Vice President, another thing that I have seen happening and that causes me to really find this offer of $200 so, insulting to people who receive these grants. Persons with disability who receive the disability grant, when the People's Partnership was in government, used to have, they were sort of, I wouldn't say pre-qualified, but they were more likely to qualify for a food card. So because of your circumstances, many people with disabilities were actually qualified and received food cards. And that helped tremendously with their costs. Because they were given the food cards, it meant that they had significant income to put towards purchase of food. And then the grant that they received could be used towards other things, like paying for their transport. And what has happened over the last few years while this government has been in office is that the food cards, hundreds and perhaps thousands of food cards, have been taken away from persons who receive disability grants. I know of persons who, this young lady, she's visually impaired, and I couldn't believe it when she approached me and she told me about her situation where she does receive a disability grant, and she was in receipt of a food card. She had been approved over years, and she went back and there was a call for people who are holders of the food cards to come into the office and take in new information and so on, and she did comply, and she was told that she no longer qualifies. And that was one story that I heard, and I was a little skeptical. I thought maybe the income of her household, considering that she lived with relatives and so on, may have had an impact. But since then, Mr. Vice President, I have encountered many people who are in the same situation. And there are thousands more who will speak out on behalf of their relatives who receive disability grant, who used to get food cards but no longer get food cards.
Thanks to the PNM.
And this is happening because of a change in policy by the present government, and which makes the persons with disability who get $1,800 now, who are burdened with increased costs for pharmaceuticals, increased costs for transport, increased costs for food, no food card, and now being given $200 per month by this government. ISPAC after the black eye. This $200 a month is equivalent to roughly $6.50 per day. You can't even reach Arima to Port of Spain on the bus route with that. Mr. Vice President, I also must add that there were special provisions for children with cerebral palsy, mothers with those children and their expenses, to meet their expenses, and that as well is one of the areas that will be affected. There are a few more things about mothers with cerebral palsy children that I want to talk about, but I know that this, the provision here may not allow me to go so far, but I just want to take this opportunity to call on the government to open the center in Central for cerebral palsy mothers, for cerebral palsy children, as well as to provide the other facilities that that were started to provide that support for those mothers. Mr. Vice President, I move on now. I move on now, Mr. Vice President. I want to go on to a matter which is very close to my heart, which is municipal corporations and local government. But I just thought I would mention one thing. The Clause 19, which speaks about the friendly societies. You know, I heard the Minister of Labour, who has the responsibility for friendly societies, speak in glowing terms about the consultations and the proposals to have the revisions for friendly societies and so on. Mr. Vice President, quite frankly, for the almost 4 years that this government has been in office, I have heard so much about consultations. And all this clause does, and while I appreciate all the glowing things that the minister indicated is being considered and is in the draft and is being considered by cabinet and so on, all this clause does is to delete the requirement for the registrar of friendly societies to be a member of the public service and for that person now to be a member, by removing the requirement for the registrar of the friendly societies to be a member of the public service. That is all this clause does.
Critical.
So, Mr. Vice President, I want to say that I look forward to seeing the result of all the consultations the minister spoke about, because I too know of friendly society. There's the Aruka Friendly Society struggling. They were threatened. They almost were shut down recently because their challenges are so, the challenges that they face now at this time, it's so tremendous. So I hope that the measures that the minister spoke about in the draft are going to somehow be able to resuscitate, and that this will not be a matter of politics, so to speak. So, Mr. Vice President, that was the short mention I wanted to make into that. And unless the person disturbing me has a point of order, I seek your protection, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I now want to move into a matter that is close to me. I served as a local government councillor for 10 years. I was the chairman of Tunapuna-Piako Regional Corporation for 3 years, and I have always remained very much a friend of local government, a strong advocate for local governance and for service delivery to be local. The amendments put forward, Mr. Vice President, with regards to municipal corporations, and I just want to directly read the summary. I want to split it up into two. The clause basically proposes to amend Section 110 and Section 112 of the Municipal Corporations Act, Chapter 2504, to allow a council to deposit and withdraw from the mayor's fund such monies, fees, and charges collected by the regional corporation as authorized by the Minister of Finance. That is one part. It also allows for the surplus corporation fund to be used for the improvement of the municipality and for the service and benefit of the burgesses with consent from the minister. Now, Mr. Vice President, that might sound good. It sounds like more money for the regional corporations. It sounds like collect your fees, your charges, or the monies, and put it to good use. Mr. Vice President, I will tell you why I think that is dangerous. A council, by resolution, with the approval of the minister, establishes a mayor's fund, or in the case of regional corporations, a chairman's fund. And the revenue for that fund is derived from donations and other contributions as may from time to time be received by the mayor's fund. And when I say mayor's fund, it also means chairman's fund. So as a chairman of a regional corporation, if I wanted to, for instance, treat the children of the region for Christmas, I would have to raise funds. The persons who are donating should deposit it into the chairman's fund, which is accounted for by the regional corporation. And I remember when I went into Tunapuna Piako Corporation, the former chairman there had set up a bank account outside of the regional corporation that was called a chairman's fund, which was really unauthorized. And the establishment of a chairman's fund is to be kept in the accounts of the corporation because it still is public funds. If a person who is the chairman or mayor solicits donation for a specific purpose and puts it into the mayor's fund, it must be accounted for, it must be audited, and so on. So the corporation, the fund would also get revenue from such monies as the council may by resolution authorize to be paid into the mayor's fund. So from time to time, at present, the monies that are collected from fees, from market fees, for example, you pay a fee to have the cesspit cleaning services come to your home. You pay a fee to process our building plan, to get the approval. From time to time, the council could approve those fees going into the mayor's fund. But I know that over the years, you have had a disagreement in principle between some CEOs and some chairmen as to whether they are in fact authorized to use those funds and put it into the mayor's fund. So while the law does allow the council by resolution to put that money into the fund, this provision in clause 15 makes it very clear that the fees, monies, and charges that are collected by the corporation can in fact go to the chairman's fund. Here is the danger. The chairman's fund is often used for social events. It is often used for events that have a political flavor. Chairmen and mayors belong to political parties. Very often, if they have a charity event, they have a social event, they have a cultural event, some I don't want to call any existing functions that take place now, but if they decide to have something on the promenade or something in their main street, and you decide to have pan and so on, and the party which you belong to, your party group activated, and the money spending from the chairman's fund. So the money that is collected from market fees, for instance, is not going to improving the market. It is going to the chairman's fund based on this provision. It is going for the chairman's fund, and very likely is going to be spent on a social event. And that is, Mr. Vice President, to me, defeats the purpose of a regional corporation collecting fees. The fees collected by regional corporations for the services they offer are very minimal. It really is not, because, for instance, the fee to clean your cesspit is very small compared to what you would pay privately. So it is heavily subsidized. The maintenance, just the maintenance of the vehicles responsible for that cleaning of that cesspit cannot be undertaken by the fees collected here. And we continue to complain about the funding in local government, and yet the little bit of resources that they collect the little bit of income they have from fees and charges, this government is now proposing to send to the Mayor's Fund to keep social events, very likely buy alcohol, very likely wine and dine people. I do not agree with that, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the provision here in Clause 15 also says that it will also allow for the surplus corporation fund to be used for the improvement of the municipality and for the service and benefit of the burgesses with consent of the minister. That sort of already exists, Mr. Vice President, because as I am aware, it is standard practice that fees collected over a certain financial year, it is audited, you apply to the minister for permission to utilize the fees towards improvement of the region. And that happens already. So while this provision sort of firms it up in law, the truth is that is what happens. That is what already happens, and I think that is what should continue to happen. So the provision should be for improving the conditions of your roads, bridges, drains, improving the recreation facilities, improving the street lighting, and developing your local communities. Let us develop the local economy. Let us ensure that vendors who are evicted from vending on the roadside, for instance, by the corporation, because they are responsible for that, that the regional corporations could use their funding to establish vending facilities to put those vendors, rather than just kicking them out, as the PNM has done over the years. So let's look at using those funds to stimulate local economy, to stimulate communities, and to improve the infrastructure, the local infrastructure. Mr. Vice President, the independent Senator Paul Richards spoke about the Brian Lara Promenade, the condition of the Brian Lara Promenade. That is a facility that everyone is familiar with because it is in the capital city. And Port of Spain is supposed to be the premier municipality. But the truth is that regional corporations have for over the years complained about lack of funding. The Brian Lara Promenade is a classic example. Port of Spain Corporation is probably the corporation that collects the highest amount of monies, fees, and charges. They wreck left, right, and center. We don't know if there's anybody in that council who has an interest in wrecking. They collect fees for vendors' booths and many other services. Yet, the Brian Lara Promenade is in the state that it is in. So again, this adds, I want to endorse the point raised by Senator Richards earlier, and this adds to my advocacy that the monies and fees collected by regional corporations, such as the Port of Spain City Corporation, should go towards improving infrastructure, such as the Brian Lara Promenade, rather than keeping social events where party groups are attending. Mr. Vice President, up to this morning, I was made aware of a situation where the councillor for Cedrus was evicted from his office because of non-payment of fees, of rental fees to the office, a measly $2,500 per month. And this is not the first time that councillors are being evicted. Over in the previous financial year, the situation was so bad that the councillors came together and spoke about it. The Minister of Local Government and Rural Development, reporting the ministry going to be cut down soon. He spoke out about it. We got a... Well, it's either you or the Minister of Finance is not telling the truth. But we did have to we had to embarrass the government into making releases for these simple expenses. And Mr. Vice President, The late releases that happened last year, it's happening this year again. And these are administrative things that if you have the willpower, the political willpower to empower local government, you will not be in this situation. And I want to, and while the clause here speaks about allowing the corporation's fund to be used for services to benefit the burgesses, this could be flexied around remedying a situation like the eviction of councillors from offices. But, Mr. Vice President, that situation is absolutely unacceptable. So you come here with a plaster, with an ice pack for the black eye. You come here with a plaster for the sore, but you are not fixing the problem. So I want to take this opportunity as the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government returns to his seat to call on the Minister to remedy the situation where councillors are being evicted from their offices because of lack of releases from the Ministry of Local Government and the Ministry of Finance for these expenses. I want to, while some regional corporations have been using the fees that they collect to pay the landlords just to keep the peace, really, that is not what they should be doing, because they are not paying it from the proper vote. And by when the ministers make late releases to the regional corporation, they are actually encouraging the corporations, they're forcing the corporations to use funds that are not for that purpose, to use it there. And really, that is not something that is ideal. So I hope that the Minister of Local Government and Rural Development will contribute today. I know he's not a person of many words, but I trust that we will hear something from him, particularly with the reports that the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development is to be split in two, and he might be losing the responsibility for corporations and regional corporations, which would be sad. But I don't know if the PNM is heading in a right direction. I've heard so much about local government reform, and I am yet to see any real action in terms of not only legislation coming here, but their application on everyday handling. They have been abusive to local government, and that must come to a stop. But if the minister loses part of his ministry, half of his ministry, I don't think you have too long again. You don't have too long again for your term in office, so we will remedy the situation.
What do you have in the rural development company?
Because they want to destroy your one.
Mr. Vice President, another area that I feel the government makes sound really nice, and their headline would be, "We are increasing the littering fines by 100%. It sounds really good. Mr. Vice President, what are those fines?
Charlie's coming back.
Mr. Vice President, those fines are $800, so that will increase to $1,600. And there are other areas where it's about 4,000, sorry. It's very small.
How much people are you charging?
So the $800 or imprisonment for 6 months, and in the case of a body corporate, a fine of $16,000 from, it was 8,000, right? So let's take it as an individual who is charged, could be fined $4,000. Could now be charged $8,000, up to $8,000. We had something called litter wardens. In the very first year of this government's term in office, they hired the litter wardens. The litter wardens were in front of the Ministry of Local Government. Mr. Hussain was not the minister at that time. They were protesting to get their jobs back. because they were hired by contract, and I know by definition they will jump up and say they never fired anybody. Their contract came to an end, and they just didn't renew it because they feel we don't need litter wardens anymore. And regional corporations were fighting up to pay these litter wardens on contract. Sometimes it was month to month, 6 months. But the fact is that they had litter warden units functioning. And they had litter wardens the corporations spent a lot of money training litter wardens to go out there and get the job done. So kudos to you. You have increased the fine from $4,000 to $8,000. Who is going to watchman this operation? You have no litter wardens, so where are you going with that? This, Mr. Vice President, will sound convincing, it will sound nice to somebody who is not aware of the situation. So it is good on paper to have the fine increased in the Litter Act. But I ask, I want to, thank you, Mr. Vice President, I want to ask if the Minister of Local Government could reply and indicate if the ministry, and it may not be his ministry, but if he has any intention of re-establishing the litter wardens units in the regional corporations. The fact that the fine for corporate, a body corporate, has moved from 8,000 to 16,000, that is chicken feed for some of those corporations responsible for littering our rivers, putting chemicals into our rivers, dumping big solid waste items and so on. And in fact, when there were litter wardens were there very often, they had to go with police to deal with some of these situations. So Honorable Minister Kazim Hussain, I call on you to re-establish the litter wardens units in regional corporations in addition to this, these increases in the Litter Act. Mr. Vice President, I want to give a small mention to endorse a point made by Senator Paul Richards with regards to the Children's Act. The fees, they spoke about at least 14,000 cases. Again, the problem here is enforcement. I know very recently there was a joint select committee where it was brought to light that the Children's Authority is still understaffed, under-resourced. Some of these fines could and should, I think that is something that should be explored, that the Children's Authority be recipient of some of those fines, because the court will determine if the fine will be charged. So while the Children's Authority will bring the matter forward, the court will decide, and then the charges, the revenue, it should be collected as a revenue, or it should be used. You must have some system as a sort of incentive. Mr. Vice President, I want to say that Madam President, I want to say that I also had a few words to say about the Wildlife Conservation Act, and unfortunately, I know that I don't have time, but I know that, Mr. Vice President, I want to say that Barack Obama said that climate change is no longer a far-off problem. It is happening here, and it is happening now. Mr. Vice President, this measure here, again, is one of those measures where that is a little drop after the fact. The truth is that we have had so many initiatives starting under the partnership where the environment was concerned. And these provisions here, it doesn't do much in my view. Madam Vice President, as I close, there are 4 stages of a battered woman goes through. Maybe because you didn't hear the beginning of my contribution, but this ties back to the beginning, Mr. President. There's denial where the woman is unable to accept that she is being abused. And I think our population has experienced that under this PNM government. There is guilt where she feels that she has caused the abuse. And I think our citizens have experienced that under this People's Partnership government. They're under the PNM government. Yes, because I'm coming to the fact that the People's Partnership's government performance is continuing to haunt them, Mr. Vice President. Mr. President. Mr. President, you also have... Look, a man who don't talk telling me to sit down.
He's only sick, he doesn't listen.
Madam President, may I have your protection, please?
You want my protection?
You have
You are
10
president.
seconds, Senator.
Mr. Vice...
Go ahead.
Madam President, but fortunately we are reaching the stage of enlightenment where she, referring to the citizens, will realize that she does not deserve the abuse and acknowledge that the abuser is the one at fault, and taking responsibility to accept that and to escape, and that escape will come for general election 2020 when the citizens will have the opportunity to rid themselves of this abusive PNM government. Thank you.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industry.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, it was not my intention to join this debate on the finance bill, but because I hold the position of leader of the House, on the government side, I do not need anybody's permission to join the debate. So I use my prerogative to make a short intervention. But before I start, Senator Diyal Singh, you're a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and there is something called a Freudian slip. And it is rooted deep in the psyche of the human spirit. And I say no more. Senator Ameen for Freudian slip, because she knows what the United National Congress has done to this country from 2010 to 20. Madam President, I really joined this debate because I felt it my responsibility as the leader of government business to congratulate Senator Deonarine for what I think was a sturdy and well thought out. And I felt relieved because her first contribution and her second, she was a little timid. And I wanted to see the true economist in her. And I must say today that I have been pleasantly surprised, and I want to commend her greatly. Because I want to respond to three things that she said. This whole scenario we're in resulted largely from an abrupt fall in energy revenue. I will deal with that very briefly, and also in response to Senator Mark. We have had 4 years of negative economic growth. And from an economic point of view, I've always had problem with negative economic growth. To me, it's an oxymoron. It's either you shrink or you grow. But I take the terminology for what it's worth. And her prescription to turn it around is to increase fiscal revenue and to reduce expenditure. That's the paradox and the dilemma we are in. Because the very people on the front bench here who criticize us when we even make an attempt without any major disruption to reduce the recurrent expenditure. You yourself, Senator Deonarine, said recurrent expenditure is made up of two things, basically, wages and salary and transfers and subsidies. So if you have to reduce fiscal recurrent expenditure, you have to touch one of the two, especially if you have fallen revenue. So we're tackling it from both ends, gingerly reducing the recurrent expenditure and making a strong focus on increasing revenue. And let me go on record again. The opposition speaks all kind of misinformation. If there's a reduction on the recurrent side, or on wages and subsidy, or transfers and subsidy, or wages and salaries, they say you are inhumane. but they're telling you where you're getting your revenue from it. I just want to go on record to say a government can only get revenue from 4 sources. The first and most important is taxation. The bulk of government revenue has to and comes from taxation. The second source of revenue, at least for Trinidad, to some extent, is dividends from state enterprises, those that are profitable. And everybody knows those are few and far between. The largest contributor for that is the National Gas Company. The third source of revenue could be disposal of state assets, but that's a one-off revenue. It's not sustainable, as we did last year or this year, where we disposed of certain state assets. Beyond that, you have nothing. Then you could borrow. Okay, but then there are constraints on borrowing. There are international parameters set by the IMF, the World Bank, what have you, the IDB, the debt to GDP ratio. If your GDP expands, you know you could manage your debt, and all these sort of economic permutation. But by and large, the revenue has to come from taxes. The bulk of Trinidad and Tobago's revenue over the years came from energy taxation. And I've said it in this house on many occasions, but I feel I made the point clear enough. So I want to make it again in response to Senator Mark. When he went on to say that we say the economy is turning around 1.9% growth after 4 years of negative growth. He said the economy is not doing well. And the only area of growth is the gas sector. But I just want to go on record, Madam President, to indicate that according to the 2018 review of the economy, the manufacturing sector grew by 7.3%. All right. This included petrochemicals, which is at 9% growth. Petrochemical is now put as a manufacturing sector because, in fact, it is a manufacturing function.
It was so last year.
And it was so last year, and I think the year before.
That is not the only growth sector.
Food, beverages, and tobacco grew by 5.6%. Textile, clothing, leather, wood, paper grew by 1.46%. So there were areas in the manufacturing sector. Granted, the bulk of the growth in the non-energy sector came from petrochemicals, which you could be argued that is part of the energy sector. But at least there is some growth in the non-energy sector. When Senator Mark spoke, when he said the gas industry was doing well, largely because of the UNC policy in 2013 to 2015. Let me debunk that once and for all. They always like to talk about Juniper. They who created Juniper. Yes? Not Angeline, Chuck and Juniper. Let me give you the secret about that. Let me give you the story of that through you, Madam President. I'm responding. Madam President, in 2016, the government received $38 billion compared to $28.6 billion in 2014. A decrease in taxation of 70%. You virtually lost $20 billion. And it went on to say the reason for that were threefold. More than generous tax concessions offered to the oil companies. They threw the baby out with the bathwater. What is the sense you're producing more gas and the state doesn't get economic rent from it? 0.53%. And that is what happened here. Let me tell you what they did, through you, Madam President. They allowed 100% write-off of all exploration costs in the year in which was incurred. You know what's the July exploration well? 60 and 70 million US dollars. And the companies were allowed to write off that in 1 year. Furthermore, they were given an accelerated allowances for write-off of other development costs. Prior to the UNC coming into power, you had a 5-year write-off, 20% in each year, in a straight line. UNC changed that to 50% in year 1, 30% in year 2, and 20% in year 3. No reason why the government experienced a precipitous drop in the revenue stream. That is the single most important reason why this country is in this position today. Furthermore, the companies were allowed to carry 100% of their losses into the other year with no cap. You see, and then Senator Mark talked about we just signed negotiation with BP. I am proud to say that we signed a negotiation a settlement with BP to retract all this. To retract all this, we will now move back to the 5-year write-off of all development costs, and we have squashed the 100% exploration write-off.
In favor of the people of
In favor of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. So that BP now could have a tax liability, because it makes no sense that you are the largest gas producer in this country, and your tax liability is minimal. We make no apologies for that. And let me just quote one more example. For the 3rd year running, this was the 2016 EITI report. The NGC is the largest taxpayer, contributing $5.7 billion to government revenue, followed by EOG Resources, which paid in 2016 $1.3 billion. BPTT, however, paid a mere $480 million. The obvious question is, how can EOG, with a production of 400 to 450 million cubic feet per day, contribute 1.3 billion in taxes, while BPTT, with 5 times the production at 2.2 billion cubic feet per day, contribute a mere 480? Because of what the UNC offered. But UNC didn't have the high capital expenditure that BP had put out. And the reason for that is that the state has an entitlement for fair economic rent. That's right. Because it is a depleting asset. And any depleting reserves, whether it's copper in Zambia or uranium in South Africa, you need a certain minimum revenue stream from the mining sector and from the energy sector. And therein lies the fundamental problem. So all the old talk you're hearing from the UNC, this is fundamental. The biggest transgression that this country has experienced in recent times. Beyond that, there's not much I want to say further in. Save and accept. I just want to respond to Senator Ameen, because she always make these wild accusations. The zero-rated VAT from 12, we reduced VAT from 15% to 12.5%. Through you, Madam President, the VAT experts tell you that the whole basic principle of our VAT system is that you must have minimum zero-rated items, especially basic food items. You couldn't keep it at home. The UNC had 8,000. How much? 7,000. Almost as much as 8. 7,000 zero-rated items. One of which was maraschino cherries. That is the cherries put on top of the cocktail. I have never drunk a cocktail in my life. Good? I will have an odd beer and a glass of wine since I had my heart surgery. Okay, but beyond that, I have never tasted a cocktail, Madam President. Maraschino cherry, I can't even pronounce the word. But that was zero-rated along with a series of other luxury items. And you say you care about poor people. So I just want to make the point that they come here very self-righteous, as if they did nothing wrong, as if they care so much for Trinidad and Tobago. They were a loose bunch of people, you know, wild in their expenditure, you know. And without taking consideration of the consequences of their action, especially in the medium and long term. And I have had enough of that. I've been here for 3 years, and it's time we start to fight back. Good? And we will not taking it anymore. Because we're going into election in 2019 and 2020, and we will make sure that the UNC never see the light of day in this country again.
Okay? Minister, please. Please. Senator Mark, members, I will allow the laughter and the camaraderie, but it is getting a little out of hand with shouting across the floor. So please desist. Okay? Continue, Minister.
And I conclude with my final point, Madam President. The 400,000 tax exemption for servants' benefit. That was largely driven by the Petrotrin servants issue. Hence the reason it is retroactive from November 30th. We have dealt with this matter frontally, the Prime Minister, myself, other cabinet ministers, members of the board of Petrotrin. We have articulated clearly to this country the rationale for so doing. We still feel the oil sector in Trinidad and Tobago has a bright future, but it has to be reorganized, retooled, re-engineered to suit the asset base in which we have. Senator Mark complained, and with some justification, that we now experience the lowest oil production since the 50s, which is true. The reasons for that are twofold. One, all the exploration beyond the 70s didn't find oil, it found gas. So we are now a gas-based economy, as distinct from an oil-based economy. But there's still some potential in oil. The potential in oil, on the face of it, and I speak here as a geologist, no longer exists off the East Coast, the North Coast, or the Southeast Coast. But it still exists significant potential for oil production in the west coast of Trinidad, in particular the Gulf of Paria, and onshore southern basin, Trinidad. That remains the basic asset base of Petrotrin. It was not managed properly over the decades. They didn't use the correct technology and state-of-the-art thinking, human resources, and technology. And as I keep saying, to be in the oil business, you need deep pockets. This is a business. If your pockets are not deep, get out.
You know why I close up. We know why I close up.
Good? And we will build a new...
Minister, just a second, please. I just asked members to desist from the shouting. I'm not going to ask again. Continue, Minister.
And we will build heritage into a model state enterprise, similar to Ecopetrol in Colombia in particular. That's the model I have in my mind. It will call for significant capital injection. We hope to generate working capital coming out of the cash flow of the new company. We will employ new, bright young people. Use the relevant technology, because the technology is transforming every aspect of business. I made mention to medicine last time I spoke about imaging. Imaging is transforming exploration also, because you are imaging the subsurface. And when you image the subsurface, you reduce the risk. You reduce the risk of drilling, because to drill a dry hole is an expensive venture. And if you can reduce the number of dry holes, you increase your chance of success, and you increase your chance of becoming profitable. But to do that, you need capital, you need technology, and you need the right type of human resource skills. University of the West Indies, the University of Trinidad and Tobago, we have scholars studying throughout the world. Texas A&M, top school. University of Houston, top school. Colorado School of Mines, top school. London Imperial College, London. These are some of the best energy schools in the world. We have graduates from them. Some working in Trinidad, some working abroad. We try to attract them to build back the oil business in Trinidad and Tobago. We have Prime Minister has been backwards again to offer land, both housing and agriculture, to former Petrotrin workers. What more do you ask of us? Facing a reality that we have faced, we faced it head on. And we have softened the fall. We have cushioned the fall in the best way we can. And most of those employees, or former employees, still have a second chance in the new configuration of the oil sector to still build a bright and prosperous future for themselves and their family. In that context, Madam President, I have made these points in relation to certain parts of the finance bill, but I want to propose to the House that we accept the finance bill in its entirety as we try to take Trinidad and Tobago along the right path for development. I thank you.
Senator Thompson-Ahye.
Thank you, Madam President. I had not intended, like the Honorable Minister, to join this debate, but I was provoked. Perhaps it is the season when the paranderos come out and say, "Ahi, ahi, ahi," that made my friend join my name in this debate. The Honorable Senator, by saying that I was his friend for many years. If I wasn't here in Parliament and heard it for myself and somebody else had told me, I would have said a lie. But it touched my nerve when they spoke about children. And I heard in the piloting of the bill, the Honorable Minister say that the bill, clause 22 in particular she was speaking about, was in direct response to the statistics from the Children Authority that 14,581 cases of child abuse were reported. Now, this is a finance bill, but I do not think that in increasing the penalties for child abuse, the government intends to raise revenue. On the contrary, I see that it is meant to be a deterrent. And the Honorable Minister of Labor, in her contribution, said that the bill at its heart demonstrates that the government puts people first. So linking these now, and these provisions in clause 22, which increases the many penalties, I wonder if there is any empirical evidence that shows that when you increase the penalties for child abuse, that, people are going to stop abusing children. And when I looked at the newspaper yesterday, and I saw the headline about we are too violent a society, we put that against the abuse of children in the society. When children are abused, they are going to become abusers generally. Hurting people hurt people. And I wonder, though, in our caring for children, why we have not put into our legislation provisions which make reporting of child physical and emotional abuse and neglect mandatory. And I've heard it time and again said, the law says you must report abuse, you must report. And when it is said so by even government officials and the media and other people, I say, where is that provision in the law? I cannot find it. It's not in the law. Because what we have in the Children's Authority Act is a very weak provision which is not mandatory. It says a police officer or any other person having reasonable grounds for believing that the child is in need of care or protection may seek the assistance of the authority for care or protection of such child. And even though the drafters of legislation will tell you that sometimes may is mandatory, this is not such a case. We find it in the Sexual Offences Act, where it is made mandatory, but it is not in the Children Act, it's not in the Children Authority Act. And when I look at what is happening around the Caribbean, Jamaica Child Court Protection Act, 2004, Grenada Child Protection Adoption Act 2010, Bahamas the Child Protection Act 2007, St. Lucia Child Care and Protection Adoption Act 2007, Guyana Protection of Children Act 2009, one can go on and on. They use strong words. You hear, shall report immediately, must report at once, must report without delay, must report forthwith. We do not have it here. And reporting is the first step, because we are not to fool ourselves to think that what comes out in the Children's Authority report is indicative of the extent of child abuse in this country. It's far from that. So we need to have that provision in our law. I don't know why but you know, the Attorney General knows that many times I've spoken, so many things we need to have. So we need to step up and deal with that. Now we talk about protecting children, and I agree totally with the provision with respect to prostitution and all the sexual offenses and the labor laws and so on. And I ask myself, going back to the Minister of Labor and her words about demonstrating that we put people first, I ask myself, where is this protection? Where is this increase in penalties in the liquor license law? Where is it? I can't find it. It's not in the law. So when I look and I see that if you sell liquor to a child or you make a child buy liquor under Section 60 and 68 of the Liquor Licensing Act, the penalty is $2,000 or 12 months imprisonment. I ask myself, who are we protecting here? Angostura, Karim, who is being protected? Certainly not the child. For years, I have written to Chief Immigration Officer, and I'm saying, there is an anomaly here. You have an immigration form which says that a child 17 years of age can bring liquor into this country. And we have a law that says you must have a sign that you cannot sell liquor to anybody under 18. So where is this child getting this liquor to bring into the country? And I've been talking about that for years. First, the immigration officer, chief immigration officer say, well, you know, we have all of these forms and we cannot just get rid of the forms. The immigration form has changed and it remains the same. Through you, Madam President, I'm asking that this law be changed, this provision be changed. I'm asking that we're talking about increased penalties to protect children. We need to put that in the law. The other thing I wish to speak about is the judges' protection that somebody spoke about earlier. And I think it bears repeating, because we're saying $3,500 for a judge who's just retired. And one knows that you get your pension, a higher pension, when you get a higher salary. And we've had, as recently as the launch of Chief Justice Clinton Bernard's book, he spoke about what judges are going through. In the earlier days, you had Justice Ibrahim, you had Justice Hossain, and all of these judges. If a judge were to retire tomorrow, and that judge is going to get $3,500? Really, we must be joking. So all of these things, I am just wondering, though, why we haven't pegged the $3,500. What is magical about this figure, that we're giving $3,500 and not a percentage of their salary? Is it that the math is too difficult? I don't know. But there must be some rationale, and perhaps that can be explained. But if you're talking about people with very high salaries, and they leave their jobs, and you know, they have to get $3,500 for a few months because that process is too lengthy. And I can't understand why the process is so lengthy to get your pension. I had to run up and down last year trying to help a widow whose son had died, and he was the mainstay. Between the corporation, your corporation, not you, through you, Madam President, but the corporation of someone in this house, and the pension down in Trinidad, in the Treasury building, up and down. And there were little kinks in the system that I was able to iron out. It certainly didn't take 2 years. So it means that you have to have the time and the will and the energy to push the pension people to get the people's pension because people are suffering. So instead of putting in these stopgap measures, find out where the kinks are and let's deal with them. So that although there are many things that are, you know, necessary in the bill and not to be commended, there are things that need fixing. I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I wish to start where the Honorable Minister of Energy ended, Madam President. The Honorable Minister of Energy, I'm not sure which clause in particular of the bill he was referring to. So I can't respond on a particular clause, but I can respond based on what the Honorable Minister said. Now, the Honorable Minister introduced into the consciousness of Trinidad and Tobago citizens via this Parliament, this Senate, by stating the model that they wish to adopt for our energy sector regarding oil and gas exploration and production and distribution. Thereafter is the eco-petrol model from Colombia. Madam President, a short search on Google would bring you to an article from Finance Colombia, dated December 6, 2017, just a year ago, titled Colombian Corruption, How 7 Scandals Have Rocked a Nation and Eroded Faith in Justice.
That's your model. That is your model.
Madam President, 7 scandals rocking a nation and eroding faith in justice. This is the company, and I want to just explain why Ecopetrol has ended on this list. And I will just say that with 3 sentences. I will explain using 3 sentences.
May I just ask the source of the article, please, so that we can double check this?
And that is not
Madam President, the Honorable Attorney General is totally out of line. He was not listening.
No, stop. Senator Obika, take a seat. Let's establish some guidelines here. Senator Ameen, please. If someone is to be out of line, please ask the presiding officer to determine that. You don't make that determination. The Attorney General has asked for the source of your information. Just simply state what is the source of your information, Senator Obika, and move on. Okay?
The source of information was given at the beginning of my presentation, and that is the finance...
Senator Obika, take a seat. Please take a seat. Please, whether you like it or not, the ruling has been made. So just give the source and move on in your contribution. There is no need for sarcasm or anything. Just continue with your contribution, please.
The source of the document, the source of the revelation, as stated, is Finance Colombia, December 6, 2017, and the title of the article, Madam President, so I now repeat, for the national consciousness, Colombian corruption, how 7 scandals have rocked a nation and eroded faith in justice. And I want to thank the Honorable Attorney General for giving me the opportunity to repeat the source. We are colleagues from the same alma mater, Madam President. And I want to explain why Ecopetrol, the company whose model the Minister of Energy wishes to introduce into Trinidad and Tobago. why they have found themselves on this list, Madam President. It says here, Colombia's state-oil company, that's Ecopetrol, has a long and storied history of corruption.
That is what I want to heritage. That is what I want to heritage.
Madam President, is this a company that any right-thinking citizen of this country would want to introduce as the model to replace Petrotrin? They go on and they state, in 2014, the company earmarked 30 billion pesos, sounds like plenty money, but $10 million US, to invest in social development projects for communities in the company's exploration zones in the departments of Meta, Putumayo, and Huila. But not 1 peso ever went to improving the conditions of people in the oil exploration zones.
Heritage, man.
2 Ecopetrol managers and 2 members of Corporation País Rural simply divided up the 30 billion pesos amongst themselves.
That is the model? That is the model.
And they were eventually given prison sentences. The quote ends at amongst themselves. Madam President, is this the level of corporate irresponsibility that the Honorable Minister of Energy and Energy Industries wishes upon the people of Trinidad and Tobago? I hope not.
That is the heritage.
Now, Madam President, I'm really grateful for the Attorney General for giving me the opportunity to elucidate. And the other point I want to address from the Honorable Minister of Energy and Energy Industries is the point that he made a statement that he's fed up. The Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance stated that they have put the economy on a good path. But I want to ask the question. More rather, I want to state that the people of Trinidad and Tobago are fed up of this government. Because 5,322 Petrotrin employees could tell you they're fed up of this government. All right? The 1,500 who would have been sent home from the energy sector contractors, they are fed up with this government. Madam President, the manufacturing sector, because when you remove, and I will deal with that in detail, when you remove the petroleum production and so on from the petroleum and chemical products from manufacturing, with this government surreptitiously added when they came into power, when you remove that from the equation, Madam President, you see that the manufacturing sector since 2014 has declined by 9.8%. All right? Since we left office, has declined by 7%. So really and truly, the manufacturing sector is saying the economy, the engine of growth, is not heating up. And the Minister of Trade has had no trophy to show, apart from borrowings, potential borrowings from the Chinese, giving away billions to Sandals and Butch Stewart, and not a single idea in terms of dollars and cents of FDI that will be coming based on the work that the Honorable Minister and the Ministry of Trade is doing. So the manufacturing sector is fed up. Madam President, the labor unions have laid judgment on this government of labor busting. They are fed up. I will deal with the Agricultural Fires Act, which is clause 23 of this bill, and I will give a report from the Agricultural Society. They are fed up. Madam President, the commuters of the country, using the roads, they too are fed up. So the Honorable Minister of Energy should be very careful to heap his disgust at being fed up, because really and truly people more fed up than them. So I want to begin the substantive part of my contribution, Madam President, by going to clause 27 of this bill, which seeks to amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, in several sections to improve the operation of the Act. Now, Madam President, colleagues on this side will be interrogating in further detail what that means, what those amendments mean in the grand scheme of things. I would confine, and they would also deal with the NIF in particular, So I will confine my commentary to a particular part, which has to do with the whole issue of an explicit government guarantee and what that means for the financial sector. That particular aspect, not the credit exposures, because that will be dealt with subsequently. Now, Madam President, the Minister of Finance, the substantive Minister of Finance, Carl Mimbut, is on record as saying that there is an implicit government guarantee when he floated the concept of the NIF earlier in July of this year. He said there's an implicit government guarantee, and that the NIF is a wholly owned company by the state. He said that the guarantee is not explicit. So let's be very clear. If we are saying that the guarantee is not explicit, and then we turn to the Act, in this clause that is being amended, and the substantive part of the Act states, Section 42(1)(a), a fully guaranteed by the government of Trinidad and Tobago that is explicit, unconditional, legally enforceable, and irrevocable over the life of the credit exposure in question. All right, so they're basically confining the credit exposure issue to investments, or by other names, that are explicitly backed by the government. Now, so when we look at the amendment with respect to 42(1)(a), it seeks to circumvent this particular characterization, which is very important. Why is this important, Madam President? Why would an explicit guarantee be important to decision makers in Trinidad and Tobago, to our sovereign credit rating as a nation, to international deals that we are party to, bilateral agreements and so on? Why would it be important? It is important because it has a bearing on the debt to GDP profile of the country of Trinidad and Tobago and the economy. So when you hide $4 billion TT dollars this year, and then you hide an additional $3 billion TT dollars based on the intended support they're looking for this current fiscal, and then you hide in the last year of office because you will be removed by the people of Trinidad and Tobago, what you are doing is you are loading up. Madam President, I'm hearing someone saying a word that is totally unsavory, and I wish for you to clarify.
Yes, it is on parliamentary ways.
And I'm sure it will reach on the Hansard. Okay. Thank you very much. So when you load up our debt profile with these implied debts, what it does is it puts your decision makers in an embarrassing position, your public servants in an embarrassing position, Madam President, where they are going to our international watchers, to these agencies that we go to for borrowings, such as the Andean Bank, CAF, that the government just took $300 million US from. And the public servants and the central bankers will be telling the government that our debt to GDP profile is 62%, 63% at the point in time. And the technocrats at the CAF, at the IDB, at the Caribbean Development Bank, for example, also will be telling you no. At the IMF has stated clearly that they are not confined to this distinction between an implied government guarantee versus an explicit government guarantee. They are not confining their decision-making, their rating of the sovereign debt profile of Trinidad and Tobago to such a characteristic. So what that does, Madam President, is it allows the government to fool the population. It allows the government to fool the population by stating that they have kept the debt to GDP profile closer to 60%, when in 2 years' time it can really cross 70% when you add these implied government guarantees. And the IMF has told us clearly, unequivocally, that it is calculated in our sovereign debt to GDP. So really and truly, the government is doing the country no favors by introducing this clause in this particular section of clause 27 to the bill. And I will leave the credit exposures because colleagues will come after who would interrogate that particular part of this bill before us. Now, Madam President, I wish to turn my attention to clause 26 of the bill. And I want to ask this question. I'm not going to deal with the substantive part of the stamp duty, but I'm going to ask the question, whether the Ministry of Housing, Madam President, whether the Ministry of Housing has stated repeatedly that the investment profile of many of the 100,000, 170,000, whichever is the figure, applicants for houses before them, is such that they are not able to engage in mortgages. It is such that they would only be available to enter into rental agreements, whether it be rent-to-own or straight rental agreements. So, putting forward this change to the Stamp Duty Act, I ask the question to the Ministry of Housing. What exactly are you doing to provide comfort and relief to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago? And I'm sure the answer there is nothing, because the last Minister of Housing, when he contributed to the budget debate when he was minister, that would have been last year, last fiscal, stated that the PNM has a roof over your house policy. And he rubbished the home-owning democracy policy of the People's Partnership Government.
That is why in tourism.
So, and I will get to the new portfolio of the former Housing Minister of Tourism. How I will get to that? I will get to that via clause 24 of this bill. So, Madam President, clause 24 of the bill deals with an amendment to the Conservation of Wildlife Act, Chapter 6701, to increase penalties for various hunting-related offenses committed under the Act. And I prepared a short piece on that, which I want to share today. Now, the Conservation of Wildlife Amendment Act. I wish to advance a policy proposal. There was a friend of mine when I was at the university. He had a position paper regarding the shift to whale watching versus whaling, which is hunting of whales for consumption. I want to use that example in this scenario. Why the government, alongside, or at least before, if not before, at least alongside the increasing of fines for hunting and tighter restrictions, why doesn't the government advance an opportunity for hunters to reorient themselves to game watchers? So this is the policy that I'm advancing, Madam President. And my friend tested this hypothesis using an econometric modeling framework and arrived at the conclusion that whale watching was more beneficial for a sustainable growth path for his country, which is St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Whilst I'm not one who has benefited from any econometric model in the case of Trinidad and Tobago and hunting, I'm saying the government should give it a try. What can be lost from reorienting our hunters to game watchers? Making sure now that the family can get involved in preserving and protecting the environment and the wildlife and generating income for themselves. So, Madam President, I want to support this argument by stating when you raise the fines from 1,000 to 20,000, right? When you raise that fine so significantly, there are communities in this country that live by hunting. Whilst Port of Spain may have the the reputation of a concrete jungle. There are persons in Moruga. There are persons just over the hill, even though it's close to Port of Spain in St. Anne's. There are persons in Santa Cruz, in Point Fortin, in Tobago, that engage in hunting. And why don't we try to bring them together? There's a Hunters Association in Trinidad and Tobago. Bring them together using that umbrella and try to engage in training to reorient them. Now, Madam President, could I ask what time I should end?
5:05.
Thank you very much, Madam President. One would have thought that the government ministers would have been grateful for this policy prescription. So,
you're opening doors, Taharqa. You're opening good doors.
So I'm sure, Madam President, the hunters in the constituency of Moruga Tableland would be grateful that someone has articulated on their behalf. I'm sure the hunters in Cedros and Point Fortin and Labray and Rio Claro and Mayaro and Toko Sangre Grande and St. Anne's would be very happy that someone has articulated on behalf.
It's not the government.
All right. And there's someone in the Maracas St. Joseph Valley by the name of Mother Earth. I'm sure she'll be very happy for this intervention. So now, Madam President, I want to go on to why this clause impacts on tourism.
Right.
Because the head of the new tourism committee for Trinidad, Tourism Trinidad, our former queen, Janelle Penny Commission, has been lamenting publicly lamenting, the newly appointed chairman has been publicly lamenting the fact that tourism arrivals have been declining under this PNM government. And I want to quote from an article in the Trinidad and Tobago Guardian, dated Thursday, September 13th, 2018, by Raphael Lal, titled Decline in Arrivals. And the subject of the article is one Mr. Brian Frontin, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Trinidad Hotels, Restaurant and Tourism Association. And he says that TNT's tourism industry is suffering, and it is time for the government to take action. I'm hearing that the Honorable Minister of Public Utilities is saying he's biased, but he should know that he is also a member of his alma mater presentation College San Fernando.
And I want to be member of the PP party.
Yes.
Don't forget.
So, Madam President,
Quran was bringing him in.
the fact is this, right? It is stated here that the industry has been in decline, and this is facts, so it can be checked. Has been in decline for several years, and the government has stood idly while the tourist arrivals have plummeted and hotels are on the brink of closure. So there's a continuous decline in our international activity at TNT. And listen to this, Madam President, because it would bring you great sorrow to hear what I'm about to say. He said that the Tourism Ministry's cessation of international overseas marketing representation in October 2016 has also hurt the industry in all our key markets, United States, Canada.
Inquire as to what part of the bill you're dealing with. Yes.
Yes, happily. So as I stated, this has to do with clause 24 of the bill, which speaks to the conservation of wildlife. And you would recall that I proposed a policy prescription that is tied to tourism.
I do. I recall Senator Obika, but I think you have to move on from that point now. I think you're stretching it, and actually you're straying from the fundamentals of the bill. Okay?
As you please, Madam President. I wish to move on to clause 23 of the bill. Now, clause 23 of the bill seeks to amend the Agricultural Fires Act, Chapter 6302, to increase the fine from $1,500 to $20,000 for an offense committed under the Act. So if I turn to my notes, Madam President, I wish to read, because this part I have not committed it to memory. So clause 23 of the bill. Excuse me. The Agricultural Fires Act and its amendment. This means that there is a proposed increased fine, along with imprisonment for 6 months and expenses incurred by the county fire control officer in controlling or extinguishing any fire caused by or resulting from the disobedience, refusal, or neglect of such person. Now, The Agricultural Society of Trinidad and Tobago, because I reached out to Madam Danu Supu upon seeing this particular amendment, this clause, Madam President. And it would interest you to know, Madam President, that the esteemed head of the Agricultural Society, one of the most important stakeholders who will be affected by this bill, stated that there are so many issues before them in the agricultural sector that they are surprised by this action, to bring this action at this time. They are surprised that no consultation was done with the Agricultural Society before making this legislative change.
No.
Madam President, I want to state the short title of that act. The Agricultural Fires Act is being amended, and the Agricultural Society of Trinidad and Tobago has not been given the respect, the common courtesy of a consultation. Madam President, that is reprehensible in the least. Now I want to state the reasons why farmers set fires. Because it is very pertinent to public education and the impact of this bill. The 5 advantages of using fire, based on an article in the Forest Ecology and Management Journal, 120, 1999, pages 157 to 169, titled Farmers' Perspectives on Slash and Burn as Land Clearing Method for Small-Scale Rubber Producers in, the name of which I can't pronounce, in Sumatra, Indonesia. Now, Madam President, it states here, 1, burning creates space. That's 51% of the reasons advanced for creating a fire. This much is obvious. Now, why is this important to state this point? Because farmers would need access to agricultural moving equipment, whether it be backhoes and so on. And if you find that there are many farmers resorting to fires, it should first be required of the government to ask if really and truly the majority of the reasons is to create space. Then the government, before bringing this bill, should assist the farmers and ensure that they have access to backhoe and other moving equipment as they need it.
Good point, good point.
All right? So if you don't have earth-moving equipment, Madam President, and that is the major reason why you will set fire. Basically, what you are saying is woe beyond to the food production of Trinidad and Tobago. The second is it acts as a fertilizer. The ash that emanates acts as a fertilizer. This is advanced as 23% of the reasons why the fires are created. And then burning improves soil structure, enabling faster establishment of seedlings. And the last 2, burning reduces weed tree competition, and burning reduces the occurrence of pests. So those 2 are minor compared to the former 3. So what may be a better position? All right? The government could have gone about this amendment in a different way. They could have first consulted with the farmers. Secondly,
And the society.
following such, we should be able to determine what type of education and research is required to be engaged in so that farmers could understand and better control the fires that they utilize, and fire prevention techniques from the experts in fires and fire management, that is the fire service or whichever competent, skilled organization is around that can help upskill farmers so that there is no indiscriminate burning, and then you look to enforce and increase the fines. Now, Madam President, after dealing with that particular clause in the bill, I want to shift my attention to clause 17, right, which has to do with the Public Assistance Act. And I want to ask a particular question. If you increase the cost of super, diesel, all right, which has a significant negative impact on persons and mobility in Trinidad and Tobago, if you do that singular act, and you don't have avenues for persons to obtain other income as they need it to cover their expenses, but you restrict persons who are otherwise unable from accessing public assistance by virtue of changing this, by virtue of this finance bill. So someone who has a disability, they need to travel, Madam President. They need to access medication. They need to do all the other things that someone who does not face such a disability have to do. So is it fair that someone who does not face such a disability can access, as my colleague said, food cards, but someone who has a disability can't, simply because they're getting money which is really to cater to their disability? I think that should be revisited. Now, Madam President, there's an article that I want to bring to your attention, and the headline is "No More Regular Gas." So I didn't work with the source of whether it be Newsday or Express, so I wouldn't refer to that article.
It's public knowledge.
I would use the primary source myself. Now, yes, it's better than Wikipedia, which I heard a former minister use. So, Madam President, I've done some work with fishing villages in Trinidad and Tobago. And there's a particular fishing village in Toko, and there's another in Irene. Two different parts of Trinidad and Tobago, but who depend significantly, in particular Irene, they depend on the regular gas at the filling station that the fishermen have at their disposal. Now, if you remove regular gas from the equation, that significantly diminishes persons' ability to move, because vehicles in that area, the fuel of preference is regular gas. Whether it be the appropriate one or not, that is not the question for debate. It is a statement of fact. So if that is the issue, and you recognize that there's increased hardship by the simple act of closing Petrotrin, but what you do is you prevent persons with disability from accessing other grants that are normally available to them, then, Madam President, that is a totally unjust act and should be revisited. Now, I want to close by referring to the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, the Honorable Minister and the Minister of Energy, because I promised to talk about manufacturing. But the Minister in the Ministry of Finance referred to growth. The Minister of Energy spoke about the upstream gas sector. And he mentioned and referenced an accounting calculation of accelerated debt recovery. I find it very difficult to accept the Honorable Minister's submission. Because, Madam President, if I am about to write off $100 million US, and I write it off 20 million year one, 20 million year two, 20 million year three to year five, versus I write off 50 million year one, 30 million year two, 20 million year three, I have nothing to write off in year four, nor year five. What that means is the People's Partnership Government took the bitter pill, engaged in accelerated write-off of debt with these upstream companies, so that this PNM government has benefited from that regime. They have benefited. They should really be on their knees saying thank you to the People's Partnership Government and the leadership of Kamala Prasad-Bissessar. But you know about this saying that when you throw pearls. Now, Madam President, and I want to use the central bank, no other source than the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. All right, headed by Mr. Alvin Hilaire. I think a senator opposite is not aware that we have a new central bank governor. Now, when you read the Monetary Policy Report for November 2018, Madam President, one of the things that would jump out at you is that the central bank is stating that BPTT's Juniper gas platform is leading the way in terms of growing the energy sector and the economy, and is, in my words, the only true bright spark. So I wanted to drill deeper into that. But there's another point I have to point to. The Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance referred to a reduction in a deficit. What deficit reduction? I want to ask the question. I've already prosecuted the point that the International Monetary Fund will under no circumstances accept the implied government guarantee of the $4 billion to the NIF as something that could be taken off the books when calculating debt to GDP. All right? The new head of mission told us that herself, Madam President. So if we are saying that the IMF will not accept it, and we know this government and the IMF, so who are you trying to fool? The IMF is not going to accept it. So when you are calculating your debt to GDP, you must include the $4 billion.
Senator Obika, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. You must include that $4 billion in our debt to GDP calculations. But you are saying before us that you've run a deficit in this year of $6.3 billion. In this year gone, fiscal 2017-2018. The real deficit to the real international watchers, who you need to go to verify when you have issues with your sovereign debt rating, when you have to go before Fitch and Standard & Poor's and so on, they take into account that $4 billion. So your real deficit is $10 billion. Don't tell me that you own the NIF and is a state-owned company, and therefore, because of that, the proceeds from the borrowing become state enterprise profit. All $4 billion that you borrow from the population could be profit. That is madness. So Madam President, the other point I want to raise has to do with the energy sector output and Petrotrin's plans. And the central bank stated in this monetary policy report for November 2018 that it's taking note of the transition cost of Petrotrin. All right? And I want to quote them specifically. It says, plans regarding state-owned Petrotrin that were announced in August 2018 are expected to have short-term transitional costs associated with a major restructuring operation of this nature. Meanwhile, the pace of recovery of the non-energy sector will partly depend on the speed of the execution of government's capital expenditure program, as well as the responsiveness of the private sector. Now, Madam President, Mr. Alcazar, the TTME, would have you know that the manufacturing sector is not in step with the government when they say that the manufacturing sector is booming. Because when you remove petroleum and chemical products from the equation, you see there's a decline in manufacturing. So therefore, and the transition cost of Petrotrin, we have already seen, probably by now has increased beyond $100 million. When you add the money paid to McKinsey, Solomon, and all the other consultants that they have engaged in. So, Madam President, what I want to remind this government is that when the People's Partnership government left office, we had over 66% attainment of tertiary level education. Over 2/3 of the population had attained that. So therefore, this population, in this age of big data and access to information, is not going to accept when you tell them that you've reduced the deficit to $6 billion, when they can see it for themselves patently that really the deficit is $10 billion, because the international watchers are not. This population is not going to accept, and they have rejected any assertion that the manufacturing sector has grown, and no cherry picking by any government minister that the clothes and fooding subsector increased and this subsector increased will give them any solace. They won't take any comfort in that, Madam President. So, and I want to close on this note. The NIB referenced that 26,000 persons less, contributions less they are getting, from June 30, 2017 to June this year. 26,802 people less. And when you look at the persons employed, and you add that to that from up to the loss of persons employed from when we left office in 2015, to June 2017, and you added the 26,000, and you add the Petrotrin 5,003, which is not included, and the TSCT 554, which is not included in the NAIB's calculation, you see that the total jobs lost under this PNM government has crossed 50,000 since they came into office. And that alone is enough for them to clock the card and leave the compound. In the words of our leader of the Senate bench, clock their card and leave office, because the people, in the words of the Minister of Energy, are fed up. The people are fed up of them. I thank you very much.
Parliamentary Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you, Madam President, for recognizing me to contribute in this bill today, an act to provide for the variation of certain duties and taxes to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters. Madam President, in my brief presentation today, I was given the task to prepare for the two clauses in this bill that relates to our ministry. That's the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. And in doing so, it was so coincidental that my friend Senator Obika raised the very two clauses that I prepared on. And let me outright rebut and reject the claims made by my goodly friend Senator Obika. Because sitting here, Madam President, listening to Senator Obika and his contribution, very comical, and I'm very confused in the position of the opposition. And let me explain that, Madam President. You see, Madam President, I stood here and listened to my friend spoke about this new policy of advanced hunting, turning them to game watchers, the sustainable growth part, preserving and protecting wildlife. And then he went on in the same breath to say persons live by hunting, bring them all together to reorient them, Madam President. And he lists some communities that depend on hunting. But I want to ask the opposition today, what was the UNC's position in 2013, September to September 2015, when they outright banned hunting in this country? Where was the love? Where was the affection to the hunters of the rural communities of Trinidad and Tobago? Because, Madam President, 2-year moratorium, 2-year hunting moratorium, Madam President, 2 years. The hunters of this country had absolutely nothing to do to earn $1 in their pockets. Madam President. Madam President.
Jobs in Renzi Complex.
So when Senator Obika comes here and beats his chest about, let us reorient the hunting population to game watchers, Madam President, I wonder, why didn't you do it when you were in office between the years 2010 and 2015?
Security force would be paid.
Madam President, there's much more to that story of the ban on hunting in this country, and more will be said at a later time. Madam President, Madam President, I'm told all you need to do is check the security bills at WASA, and there you will find what really the intention was that period to ban hunting in this country.
Check it out.
Check it, Madam President. Madam President, the goodly senator also went on to indicate that no consultation was done to make this change to the Agricultural Fires Act. And he quoted some organization in the realm of consultation, Madam President. And he suggested that the government should help the farmers. Madam President, it was, let me get the exact date. It was on March 25th, Friday, 2016, Madam President. A senior forester, too, Keith Campbell, age 56, and a team from the Forestry Division of the Ministry of Agriculture responded to a forest fire in Lady Chancellor Hill in St. Anne's, where today, that brave soldier of the Ministry of Agriculture is no more with us, battling a forest fire that was allegedly caused by someone burning simply rubbish. Dead, gone. May his soul rest in peace, Madam President. So when we come here and we make that amendment, I don't think as a responsible government we need to consult much more where lives are concerned in our officers of the Forestry Division battling, and as I'm on this point, Madam President,
Well said.
the fire season, for those who don't know, started on December 1st, just a few days ago, and it will continue to the 13th of June next year. So this is the period, Madam President, that our officers, the brave, loyal, patriotic citizens of this country, have to go out there every day and face these challenges. And what makes it even more demanding, Madam President, most of these fires are caused by persons who have not followed the law in attaining their permits and seeking guidance to have forest fires and agricultural fires, burning rubbish and so on. So I don't need to explain, I don't need to consult much more than to use that example in the example of Mr. Keith Campbell, who was gone, serving this country in dealing with forest fires, Madam President. Madam President, why are we here? And these two clauses found itself in this package of amendments today. You see, Madam President, when this government took office in 2015, as I indicated earlier, we came into the removal of the moratorium. So when we came into office, hunting had already started. And that 2-year period that the hunting season was banned, we were told by the UNC, Madam President, that the reasoning for banning the hunting was a data exercise to understand what the populations are, to understand what the breeding patterns are. And Madam President, after months of trying to get that data from all those involved in that exercise, all we found was a trace of hundreds of millions of dollars that was paid to security firms in the forest. Madam President, no data to justify the banning outright of hunting. So when coming into office and you have that situation, immediately the Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, Honorable Senator Clarence Rambrot, he initiated a roundtable discussion which, for the first time in many years, involved 20 different organizations, and I would list them. So when Senator Obika indicates we have no consultation and all of that, Madam President, I want to put that to rest where this is concerned. Because this roundtable discussion, Madam President, happened in us coming into office, and it is the first time that we could have documented views from both sides, conservationists and hunters, sitting in the same room, contemplating changes that will benefit the country and not an individual or a certain segment. And that roundtable discussion, Madam President, we entertained Mr. Courtney Park was then the Conservator of Forests, he was the chairman, then followed by Mr. John Rajman, then Conservator of Forests, Ms. Nadra Natai Gan, the Zoological Society of Trinidad and Tobago, she co-chaired that committee, Ms. Tamara Dukran, Senior Legal Advisor, Ministry of Agriculture, Dr. Riza Mohammed, President of the Trinidad and Tobago Assembly of Hunting Associations, Mr. Buddy Miller, the Confederation of Hunters for Conservation of Trinidad and Tobago, Ms. Pat Magai, Council of Presidents of the Environment, Ms. Angela Ramsey, Wildlife Biologist, Tobago House of Assembly, Dr. Mark Devatile, Papaboa Conservation, Romano Macfarlane, Wildlife Biologist, Forestry Division, Ricardo Sorello, Game Warden 2, David Boudou, Vice President, Zoological Society, and the committee also had the expertise and contributions from Lionel Emmanuel, that's the alternate member of the Confederation of Hunters for Conservation of Trinidad and Tobago, and Council of Presidents of the Environment, Ryan Mohammed and David Rostad. Madam President, this listing I've just called out, I want to pay particular attention and congratulations to this team that sat throughout this period of time to meet and thrash out all the various views by civil society and the general population. Because what they sought to do, Madam President, is dissect, analyze, go through all the legislation that deals with hunting and deals with conservation of wildlife in this country. And then advise and they made recommendations to the Honorable Minister, who later took certain pieces of documents to Cabinet. Madam President, as I indicated, at that point in time, it was noted that this was the first such gathering, a focused gathering in recent history of persons representing divergent views coming together with the aim of discussing changes in the hunting industry of Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam President, I want to stress the consensus was that the overall tone of discussions was open and frank, and that the conservationists made more concessions away from their philosophies and value system to accommodate the ingrained cultural practice of hunting in Trinidad and Tobago. Because, Madam President, in this season of Christmas, almost all the parties you go to, wild meat is served. And in doing so, Madam President, this committee had to go through, dissect, analyze, make recommendations to effect some of what we are about to do here in amending the law of this country. Subsequent to that roundtable discussion, Madam President, a steering committee was appointed by the Minister of Agriculture. And the steering committee conducted a series of public consultations, and at the forefront of these consultations were recommendations from the participants in terms of the increase of fines under the Conservation of Wildlife Act. And that is why we are here, Madam President. In September 2016, recommendations by the steering committee, they were entertained, and we all remember Cabinet would have enacted the increase in the cost of a state game license from $20 to $100 each. The revision of Parts 2 and 3 of the second schedule of the Conservation of Wildlife Act to allow for hunting of only certain species of waterfowl and cage birds, which can be sustainably hunted as presented, was done. So, Madam President, the amendments we are doing here today came from a prolonged chronological consultation, and that's the reason why we are here. October 2016, Madam President, the Wildlife Conservation Committee was appointed with a mandate to review and advise the Minister of Agriculture on recommendations contained in the final report from coming out of the roundtable discussions. Madam President, I wish to also indicate that recently the Minister of Planning and Development and the EMA, Environmental Management Authority, declared the scarlet ibis one of our national birds and environmentally sensitive species. Madam President, the applicable fees for hunting or in any way impeding or interfering with the scarlet ibis, and when you understand the clauses that we are about to amend here today, I want to indicate that we must not confuse hunting and breaches under the Conservation of Wildlife Act, Chapter 6701, and that of the Environmental Management Act, because it is clear that some species in our country They are environmentally sensitive species and they are protected, and the fine for hunting those, Madam President, is $100,000. So clause 24 of the bill signals a clear intention of the government to provide a deterrent to potential illegal activity on conservation effects, and this is expressed in the severity of penalties proposed. Because I heard from my colleague, Senator Deonarine, when she was making a presentation, she spoke to some of the fines being increased by 100%. Madam President, when you look at the severity of the fines listed in clause 23, and that amends all the sections of the conservation of, clause 25 of the bill that seeks to amend all the sections that deals with penalties. Madam President, you would agree with me that the fines are significantly increased and very severe. Madam President, so let me go to some of the clauses as it would appear, and I will indicate how it affects how we do business.
Can I just ask you how long you're going to be again? Will you be?
5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam President. I did say I was going to be short, but precise. Madam President, so when you look at the bill in terms of the amendments, clause 25, and you turn to section 4 of the parent legislation, Madam President, we propose to increase that fine, and if someone hunts in a game sanctuary in the country, Madam President, we have 12 game sanctuaries throughout the length and breadth. Persons who breach this, the current fine, Madam President, is $1,000. We propose to increase that by $10,000. I think that's a 1,000% increase, Madam President. In sections 5(2), hunting protected animals without a special game license, we propose to raise that fine from $1,000 to $10,000. Failing to produce a state game license, that's section 6(3), we propose to increase the fine from $100 to $1,500. Madam President, section 6(4), failing to obtain a state game license, we propose to increase that fine from $400 to $4,000. Section 6(5), hunting while disqualified, we propose to increase that fine from $2,000 to $10,000. Section 7(4), hunting during the closed season or exercising dogs during the closed season, we will increase those fines from $2,000 to $10,000. Section 13, failing to give a place of abode or giving false information, we propose to increase that fine from $100 to $5,000. Section 15, assaulting, obstructing, resisting a game warden, we propose from $1,000 to $10,000. Payment of compensation instead of a fine from $200 to $10,000. Export of animals without permission from $2,000 to $10,000. Offenses without fines specified from $200 to $5,000. Limits of minister to prescribe fines under regulations from $200 to $10,000. Madam President, and in closing, it must be noted that the proposed increases in fines and limits will not affect the discretionary imposition of imprisonment for specified periods as provided for under the Conservation of Wildlife Act. So, Madam President, I just want to end with one line, which I have. Madam President.
Thank you.
This government, Madam President, continues to respect conservationists who decry the idea of hunting on grounds that it threatens wildlife and disrupts nature. But in the same light and the same token, Madam President, we must understand that hunting is a legitimate economic activity for some, mainly rural communities like Rio Claro, Moruga, Guayaguayari, Bish, right up to Matlot. So, Madam President, this government continues to work in the best interest of this country under our Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, and we must support this legislation to effect a greater Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, at this juncture, we will suspend the sitting and we will return at 6 p.m. And when we return, Senator Drayton will resume the debate.